In today's video, after going through what was going to be the meta comp in the Mythic Plus for the next season, the very likely one at least, it is now time to move through the raid. We're starting first, since there is some 30, 40 something specs to go over. We're going first with healers. Well, because they are the smaller ones, right? Tanks or whatever, healers, there's only 3, 4, maybe 5 of them that you're going to be playing with in the raid. So we're going to be looking at, first of all, of course, the more relevant one is what they have been doing in the PTR when it comes to raiding, right? These results right here are obviously the closest thing we have to seeing how they did in terms of performance up to 20 days ago, I think, because this was on the 11th of July, right? So the performance of these specs. And then, however, we also have to take in mind this, because these 4 things right here are what happened since the 11th of July, right? Since the last set of round of testing when it comes to raiding with the PTR tuning. So if these specs have been changed, right, have been changed in healing, especially since the last time that there has been any testing. And we can already say and tell everyone that, for example, this was buffed quite significantly, this was nerfed by a bit, this was nerfed by a bit, so there might be some things changing based on the results in the PTR. So we already have, based on our video on the Mythic Plus expected comps, what we have for the Season 3 healer tier list in Mythic Plus, right? The only question pretty much being at the top, whether or not point number 1 is Resto Druid's Wildstalker tier set going to be nerfed, since it's bugged and it's overperforming. Point number 2 is, in the end, the power of Absorb Shields going to be what is more necessary in high keys in Mythic Plus, making Discipline Priest win out. And then number 3 is the power of Absorb Shields going to be enough to make up for the fact that Discipline has far less throughput, constant party healing than Resto Druid. That's pretty much the only question we have for Mythic Plus. For the raid, so if we were to go purely by the results of the PTR from like almost a month ago, right, then this, let's even put them in proper order, this is what pretty much it would be looking like. You would have something like this, with also some significant gaps in between. That's based on what we saw from the PTR only. So there are, of course, a few things to take into account. For example, the fact that Holy Paladin has been buffed back to back. They have now presumably gotten much better, right, over time, based on the amount of buffs they have been receiving. One of their more powerful sets of buffs were not just buffing Eternal Flame, but buffing Holy Shock as well, which were already the strongest spot healing tools of any healer, purely in terms of how much they are healing. If you compare them with Serenity, with Vivify, with Healing Surge, which you can't even cast, otherwise you'll out of mana in 2 minutes, things like Living Flame even of an Evoker, these were the 2 strongest ones, and these have been buffed by quite a bit, on top of other things like making the power of your grouped, clamped up healing of your Sun's Avatar weaker, but buffing flat out your Dawn Light by more. So they have received quite a few good overall buffs, so their power, even compared to what they had in the testing, has been increased. Then there was the question mark of Discipline. We have touched multiple times that we do believe, me and my college of erudites and intellectuals believe that these results are basically frauds from Discipline Priest, because it's the PTR. It's just harder to come up with timings, notes, because you don't know the boss. You don't know what the boss does. You don't have the timings prepared and planned. And this is what basically everything Discipline Priest does, is just prep for some big CD window. Unlike other specs, for example, which have an easier time testing in the PTR, you know, specs like Resto Druid, specs like Holy Priest, they can just mesh out their buttons. Discipline, not as much. They actually need to be able to prep these kind of things to heal, so these results weren't nearly as indicative of their power in the raid. So we don't really believe the value of their testing in the PTR. And yes, in case you think you remember Discipline Priest being nerfed since then, you would be right. However, the nerf was for Mythic Plus. The value of the Absorb Shield from this being nerfed down to 30%, the value of the Absorb Shield from this being nerfed by 16%, it's basically value for Mythic Plus. The value in your raid is your ramp, is the power in your ramp, in your big burst window, and that is getting buffed in 11.2. Because 11.2, this discipline gets the Oracle tier. The Oracle tier, TLDR, first of all gives you more burst because you have more damage in your penance, and then you get 2 free stacks, i.e. 2 free casts of penance every ramp, because every ramp either has piety plus insight, so you press piety meaning you get 2 stacks of the CDR, or it's clairvoyance plus solace, which is again 2 stacks of your penance reset. So it gets stronger, your ramp, because you get 2 more casts of penance in the ramp, right? So since, as it often happens, you will end up requiring 1 big burst healing class in terms of healer, these specs definitely don't have any particular burst healing, definitely not any to be compared with Discipline Priest, right? This is Resto Druid, struggling to even get past 7.5 million unless they use all their CDs at once, you know, Tranquility, both of their Trinket procs, their Flourish, you know, and they barely sneak by 10 million. Meanwhile, Discipline Priest gets to 10 million twice and past 20 million in 1 ramp. So that's the kind of thing they do in the raid, which will still be necessary. Now, as for the other healers, you do have the also increased value of Resto Druid. So we have had a video about Resto Druid, their power, the bug they have that might not be fixed before the release of this season. The power of this, though, doesn't really come from their bug, because their bug around rampant growth is also tied to having double life bloom, is tied to playing with Tranquil Mind to give you an extra stack of clear casting, so that your tier set, your Druid tier set, which makes use of the clear casting procs. Casting regrowth with clear casting causes the blooms to spread. The bug, as we said yesterday, is that this doesn't just proc on you. So when you use this and you spread to symbiotic blooms, it also procs on the targets you have tagged with the heal over time of regrowth from your 2 life blooms. This doesn't happen in the raid because you don't play with Tranquil Mind, you don't play with double life bloom anyways, so the value of that is much less in the raid. What we do believe has an increased power of Resto Druid. Well, first of all, technically, if Resto Druid is meta in Mythic Plus, you are more bound to have them popular in the raid as well, but also because the state of Druids right now. And the state of Druids means that this is poor, this is at the moment unplayable, and Feral is just Feral. Nobody wants to play Feral, ever. So this means that when you're put in a situation where you have to ask yourself, yes, sure, but we still need a Druid raid buff, then who are we bringing? At the moment, the most likely one to sneak in and make it as a raid buff is Resto. So yeah, it's a bit of a cheese, you know, they're cheating their way into being A tier because of that, but you still have to count it if you're talking about being a raid healer. They do have an increased chance at being meta because of it. We would be putting, for example, Resto Shaman here if both of the Shaman DPS specs were complete garbage, but they are not, especially Elemental, so they stay here. If Prot Paladin was unviable and Ret was doing noodle damage, only Paladin would be here. They're not. So actually, yeah, Ret Paladin is terrible. Prot Paladin, though, is very good and practically a guaranteed tank in the Resto World First, like progress, so Holy Paladin doesn't get any higher. Resto does, though, because the other druids are doing very poorly. In terms of their healing profile, is very average. Like, it's just like Holy Priest, they have a very consistent throughput. In the case of Druid, they are more over the course of a minute, because guess what they do in the raid as their power point? They use Convoke and they use Flourish every minute. That's what they do, right? That's their playstyle in the raid, which is still solid for constant throughput. And to remind everyone, they are one of the strongest spot healing specs because of how much power was given to regrowth and how much they can heal with regrowth in the raid. It's still a very good throughput spec with good spot healing. Above them, though, you have the trio that we have seen before. So Holy Priest is here and stays here because since a month ago, where we have seen was one of the better performance, they haven't been touched. They have not received any nerfs, any changes. They are the same since a month ago, and since what they were a month ago is still very good. They have still a very consistent throughput because they don't really have super powerful cooldowns. Their only way to do, to almost pass that as an actual cooldown is to use Divine Hymn together with one of your premonitions, either your actual heal premonition, so Piety, which wasn't used here, or to use Clairvoyance, so all three at once. They didn't. So Divine Hymn wasn't buffed in healing by like 100% or something, so the cooldown won't really show up here doing much or looking big or anything. Their power is in their consistent throughput healing and in their spot healing, which has been gigantically buffed by their incoming tier set. 2-piece casting Prayer of Mending heals your target for 1400% spell power. This is 1600%. So this is only 15% weaker than this. We have it here even actually being slightly better. The average of this Serenity, for example, is 1.92 million per cast. The average of this Prompt Prognosis is 2 million per cast. So a 2-piece set bonus effect is stronger than your keystone main button of your spec for single target on a default 1 minute cooldown. And this is stronger. And this is tied to pressing something on like a 10-second cooldown. That's how powerful this makes it for spot healing. And your spot healing was already decent, of course, because you had Serenity. You already had a decently chunky single target heal, which now you also had some pretty nice healing on the move with things like Flash Heal. And now you even have the 2-piece set bonus. Everything synergizes even more because the 4-piece works just like Discipline, so you get 2 free cooldown resets of Prayer of Mending, which is also of this. So you get more casts of Prayer of Mending, more procs of this, and the more casts, of course, you get of Prayer of Mending, it means you buff this entire line of talents. The more healing per bounce remaining, the 2 extra bounces, the chance to not to consume a bounce, the chance to reset your mending with your holy words, and then each bounce gives you a stack, and when you get to 50, you get to Apotheosis. So it's all very, very synergistic with Holy Priest, and I feel like we also have to mention this because it will now be even more relevant in this tier where they are much more likely to be meta with this one being available. Restitution is still very good for the raid, for progress, because you die, you get into Spirit of Redemption, maybe you can even find a way, if you don't need the mana, for example, to sneak a point here to make your Spirit of Redemption last 30 seconds, and you have 30 seconds of healing for no mana cost at 50% the range, 50% extra range, so you have like 80, 75 range or something to your abilities, and then you auto-rest yourself. So it's a cheat death that also saves you mana for 30 seconds. It's extremely good for progress when you can, die way more often and it's way more dangerous. It is also a very good tool for Holy Priest for progress, and since their healing hasn't been nerfed and their profile is still very good, they are locked in for being at a very likely chance of being played. We're not really gonna spend much of any time talking about Mistweaver because nothing basically is changing from Mistweaver. Yes, they have been nerfed by 5% and their tier set just lost a grand total of 5% of haste. It used to be 15, now it's 10. But considering how well they were doing, it doesn't really matter. They are still just extremely good. The only question really is the same reason as we have been asking ourselves, why at the beginning of the progression all of these monks right here were not playing with the good results you have just seen in this PTR, where these results come from Yulon. The major problem at the beginning of the season in 11.1, for example, besides also bosses being good for the build, was the fact that Yulon costed a lot of mana. It was very hard to sustain early on in the tier. So there could still be the question early on, when you have less gear, you have less power, all of your healers in the raid are healing for less, the players are taking more damage from the unnerfed bosses, you have to spend more mana. Can Yulon keep up compared to Chiji, right? That could be the question for Mistweaver, but besides that, they're still one of the highest likeliest specs to be part of the comp in terms of healers. The question of preservation is an interesting one, because preservation was doing extremely good in the PTR. It was one of the top 3 in the healing results. They have been nerfed, although the nerf wasn't as big as expected, or rather believed, because this Essence Bomb used to be doing 500% spell power. Don't read this. 500% spell power cut in half as a nerf. So basically what you see here, this was cut in half. So it's like, what, a 7% nerf? Actually, the logs that were going all in on this cycle of healing past your engulfs with these bombs were doing even 25, even 30% of the healing with this. So it looks like a mega nerf. The thing is that engulf was also fixed to now go back to healing way more. What Blizzard tried to do, they realized that this combination made no sense. We use engulf, and after using engulf, we gain a buff that buffs our Dream Breath. But it makes no sense, because the power of our engulf is based on the size of our Dream Breath. So we want to buff Dream Breath before we engulf, not after. Why is this tier set buffing our Dream Breath after we have used engulf? We wanted our Dream Breath buffed before we casted engulf. So Blizzard tried to fix it by make this happen like 0.001 seconds before you click engulf, or as you click engulf, so engulf would benefit from this buff. So engulf would get the 25% buff of the Dream Breath. However, with this tiny little tweak, they also killed the existing buffs you had of Dream Breath. So they killed Call of Ysera, which was a 40% Dream Breath buff, and they killed the 4 stacks Temporal Compression Tempo Charge, which was a 20% Dream Breath buff. So yes, you were now getting this 25% buff on your first engulf cast and your 50% buff on your second engulf cast, but you were losing the 60% buff on these two. So the fix was that now you have been nerfed in this by 50%, but this one was buffed back up by like 30-ish%. So the nerf was much less big than expected or than believed initially. So with this slightly less big nerf for preservation, they're still extremely good. They have, as you can see, a very reminiscent type of healing profile. It is not reminiscent of this. It is also not reminiscent of a monk. It's not reminiscent of a holy paladin either. Obviously, it's reminiscent of discipline. That's the thing they do. They do double engulf. After double engulf, they have 10 seconds where they can pop their essence bombs after each of the engulfs, right? That's the power window. So basically, it makes it so that it's first of all hard to imagine both of these to be together in the same comp at the same time, because they are trying to do the same things. What's worse, they're not even trying to do the same things in different timers, like Resto Druid having a 1 minute, timing of their cooldowns. No, Disc has Atonement with Evangelism on a 90-second cooldown. Evoker has this healing window with Stasis. The bigger one will always be with Stasis on a 90-second cooldown. They also have the same cooldown patterns, both of them. So usually this ends up with one of them winning out and playing and the other one not playing, because it's just not as easy to keep them both together, because they also, for example, have horrible spot healing. How do you save players chunk down by those mechanics hitting 3, 4, or 5 targets that they keep taking damage? They can't do shit to them. Discipline can do very little. Yes, you can play, your absorb shields, your penance, power shield can still be very valuable to save one person every 7 seconds or so, but that's not exactly spot healing. So it creates this issue where 2 of them together, or even double, would make it very, very tough on the rest of your healers to pick up the slack, for example, of spot healing. So that's why discipline stays here, because at the moment in this kind of profile, preservation is just better. That's what it is, and what puts preservation here above discipline. Discipline still have its niches. Like, for example, sure, it's been nerfed, but it's still a 2% damage reduction. Sure, they still also have barrier that might come in handy, and they bring PI. Somehow, I know, it always feels like Discipline finds a way to squeak in the race to world first comps every time because of the defensiveness they can bring, but at the moment, at the very least, Preservation does seem like to just be a better version in terms of healing profile than Discipline. The last one we haven't mentioned yet is Resto Shaman. They were doing okay healing, they haven't been buffed, they haven't been nerfed, they have stayed the exact same. It's solid. Their spot healing isn't as good as other specs' spot healing, because they only have, if they play Totemic, they basically have nothing. They don't even bother to play Healing Wave as Totemic, they only have Chain Heal, their Riptide is very weak anyways. If you play Farseer, which is what you will be playing, yes, you have more ways to heal. Between Riptide, but not even Riptide, Healing Wave, when you play Healing Wave, you have your Ancestors duplicating your single target heal, so it's extra healing on top of that. It's still weak though. These numbers, these numbers right here are still weak numbers when you compare them to numbers like not Evoker, not Discipline, numbers like Resto Druid that can pop 1.5 million plus the hot on their regrowths, spammable, or Priest with a new tier set, 2 million. Every player of Mending, it's much better spot healing. As you can see by the healing profile of both Totemic and Farseer, it's a much more consistent healing profile. This might seem like spikes, but the number here barely even breaks 7.5, which is not very big, right, compared to Evoker, compared to Discipline. So they have consistent healing. They don't have a lot of spot healing. They have lost a lot of power in their cooldowns. Ascendance doesn't have Ancestral Guidance anymore. Healing Tide is always a meme cooldown, so they don't have a lot in cooldowns as well. They have Spirit Link. That's true. That's the one thing that is still super powerful. Their biggest asset, which is a much bigger power in this season, is that when you play Farseer, both thanks to the fact that you play way more with Healing Wave and Riptide, which are very cheap in mana, and also thanks to your tier set of Resto Shaman with Farseer giving you 25% mana discount for 8 seconds every 30 seconds, which is a lot of mana discount. The result, when you compare, for example, a Chain Heal spamming Totemic Resto Shaman, which is very similar to what you have been doing right now in the raid as a Resto Shaman. When you compare the mana of both, you will see the Totemic Resto Shaman going down to, like, what is this, 15% mana after 4 minutes 40, with also a Symbol of Hope. The Farseer one, with nothing, not even a symbol or a mana potion, drops as low as 48.3% mana after 5 minutes 40. So 1 more minute than this, with astronomically more mana. That's how easy it is to keep your mana now when you play Farseer, which is very good for the raid. It's very good for progression, to have tons of mana to spend. It's very nice. But in terms of healing profile itself, they don't really bring anything special, anything unique to the comp, and as we mentioned, they are not in the possibility of getting a freebie spot because the other shamans are garbage, the DPS ones because they are not, so they don't even get that free pass. So this would be the result in terms of the tier list. Obviously, in the end, it's gonna come down to your composition and what you are playing as tanks and DPS. The most likely thing to happen is that you're playing Mistweaver, Prez, Holy. What are the alternatives? The alternatives are you don't have a Druid other than a Resto. So you cut a Mistweaver and you play Resto Druid. Other alternative, you might want to cut a Mistweaver. This will be a surprise though. You might want to cut a Mistweaver for a Holy Paladin or a Mistweaver for a Resto Shaman. The other alternative is, at the end, as we suspect, the Discipline Priest somehow finds a way. But this would be hard to make happen. It's more likely that Disc would cut Prez and you would run with double Mistweaver. The other unlikely options would be a single Mistweaver to make space for Holy Paladin, or a single Mistweaver to make space for Resto Shaman, or same reasoning, Resto Druid to play with a Druid in your raid, because of how hard it is for this combination to happen. So basically, in short, what is more likely to happen, I guess, if we were to talk about the chances of making it in, we would have to do something like this, where these two are much more likely to make it in, and then this is the rate of the others making it in, based on a few things like, do you have Druids in your comp? Is your officer a Resto Shaman, for example? That will also be pretty important. That's how it would look, at least right now, based on both the results from the PTR testing of the raid, the following balance tuning that happened. So obviously, if this was nerfed by 30%, we would have to have changed our minds. And then other smaller things that might, for example, be the Tetris game of slotting in your specs between DPS, tanks and healers in case you would need some raid buffs. And you would slot one of the healers to cover the raid buff. One of these three, for example, where this one is the more likely one to make it in if that was the case. So this will be our expectation when it comes to the meta of the healers, which, funnily enough, is very similarly reversed to this. The three healers we put at the top and we expect to be playing in the raid are these three. And they are conveniently the worst one in Mythic Plus. You know, maybe even Mistweaver here, but it will still be towards the bottom of the results, and in the raid it's upside down. So at least you have choices in what you want to play as a healer. You can have some fun playing main Mistweaver, Mythic Plus alt, Resto Druid, for example, you know? That's cool. So this is what we expect when it comes to the meta comps in the raid for the release of the season. We will see, of course, there is still time for balance tuning, but Blizzard has been quite reticent in greatly changing the power of the healers. At this point, the more likely possibility, as mentioned, is the bug fix change of Resto Druid, which would likely still not change their state. Their state is they are not being played unless you don't have druids to be playing in the raid for the raid buff, in which case they get played. That's kind of their status right now. But besides this though, on this Sunday we have gone on long enough. I can only imagine when I try to make a tier list video about the DPS if this is how long we get to go when talking about healers. So for today, on this Sunday, it is now time to leave each other. We are starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I might have went overboard with the light whenever I take down my blinds. This is a bit too much though, come on.